Hello, I'm Robert Moynihan, the editor of Inside the Vatican magazine, with Matt Gaspers, a colleague and is someone who's just done a new interview with Archbishop Vigano. It's Tuesday, August 6th, 2024, a day which is the Feast of the Transfiguration.
hmm
And I suppose that's one of the main themes. We want to always participate in the transfiguration from what is earthly and human to what is divine and holy. And it's a difficult task. And our church and our world are facing tremendous problems. And we take the case of Archbishop Vigano, a case that involves many souls, as an extremely important case in our time. And Matt, you're becoming an expert on this matter.
Well, I don't know if expert is warranted, but certainly a close follower of the events. And as most people know, I've been a big fan of Archbishop Vigano over the last several years. I consider him a friend, and I think he considers me, he's come to consider me as such as well. And I know the same is the case for you. But so, yeah, as you said, this is an extremely important case. It's not every day or even every decade that an archbishop, a prince of the church, is declared excommunicated by the Holy See. That is a very big deal, and it deserves to be very carefully analyzed, all of the different things that have led up to this. So thank you to everyone who's joining us today from around the country and around the world. I see in the live chat we've got some people from all the way from Brazil. There's someone else, Divine Intervention, Ontario, Canada, Rapid City, South Dakota, I see also. So we already have an international audience, and we're not even 5 minutes into the show. What about that?
Yeah, well, I think I'm not sure we'd be given divine help, but I think it's the case because by our own efforts, we're doing things beyond what our efforts really could. How can we bring people from around the world? It's kind of amazing to me too.
It is. It is that. So I think today what we want to do, this is really going to be the first episode of a 2 episode series on the subject of the Vigano case. We want to recap today everything that's transpired, beginning with Archbishop Vigano making it known publicly that the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith had accused him of the canonical crime of schism, and start with that as our starting point, going through all the different steps, the timeline of things that have transpired since then, and then we'll get into some of the details of my recent interview with him. I'm thankful that he was able to conduct an interview. I believe it's the first one since the DDF released their penal decree. So we will look at some of his comments there, and then kind of building up to dealing with some theological issues that are involved with his position. So that's how I see our discussion going today.
Yeah, and I guess we would say the supreme law of the church is the salvation of souls.
hmm
And in this case, we've got the soul of Archbishop Vigano, who's been excommunicated from the church, and he regards it really as irrelevant because he's regarded the church as in some way in eclipse or having somehow departed from its, and that's precise from its authority and its fidelity to Christ. And so that's a profound charge that he's making. And the souls of all the viewers and of all Catholics, as we look at this one case, you say, is there something to this position? What's right about it? What's wrong about it? And we're thoughtful laymen, and I've met the Archbishop, and we also recognize the role of the Pope, the central role in the faith. And there are people out there with podcasts who speak about the essential characteristic of the Catholic faith is to stand with Peter. And yet, this is being brought into question by activities and decisions of the Pope, which all of us are occasionally perplexed by. And so it's a universal question now how to deal with these individual souls and then with the larger institutional and doctrinal question of the role of a bishop, an archbishop, and with the role of the Pope and his curia around him and his teaching. And it somehow is a lens through which we can view the entire crisis of the faith in the early 21st century. And that's why we think we should pursue it.
Yes. All right. Well, with that, we can go to
Oh,
our.
we have one thing. Zambia is watching, Matt.
Oh, wonderful.
May God continue guiding. Zambia is watching. It's a pretty heavy burden. We appreciate you watching and do our best. Let's go.
Yes. All right. So we put together a slideshow for today. We're obviously not going to read every word on every slide, but we do have a few highlights that we want to show you. This is a picture on the left side of the actual DDF decree and summons, which was dated June 11th, 2024. This is what Archbishop Vigano made public through his social media and on his website on June 20th. So basically on June 11th, he says he received via email this summons from the Vatican to present himself on June 20th, 2024, so that the same, meaning Vigano, may take notice of the accusations and evidence concerning the crime of schism of which he has been accused. And this crime essentially consists of three components, as you see in yellow there. Number one, denial of the legitimacy of Pope Francis, and that'll be a significant focus of our discussion. Number two, rupture of communion with him. And number three, rejection of the Second Vatican Council. And as our viewers may recall, the Vatican said you need to come to the Vatican by June 28th at the latest, or you need to send some sort of a written defense. And in the absence of that, you will be judged either way. So they were encouraging him to either come to the Vatican in person or submit a written defense, which he did not do.
So
So I think
essentially, they wanted to bring this to a head and to an end with a deadline.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So going on to our next slide. There we go. So as I mentioned, he made this public on June 20th, along with an announcement, he called it. So he said, I regard the accusations against me as an honor. It is no coincidence that the accusation against me concerns the questioning of the legitimacy of Jorge Mario Bergoglio and the rejection of Vatican II. And this kind of summarizes his entire position in some ways. The council represents the ideological, theological, moral, and liturgical cancer of which the Bergoglian synodal church is the necessary uh, metastasis, referring to a cancer spreading in the body.
Well, those are powerful words.
And he also said in that statement, that announcement, no Catholic worthy of the name can be in communion with this Bergoglian church, he puts in quotes, because it acts in clear discontinuity and rupture with all the popes of history and with the Church of Christ. And as we'll see, this is one of the reasons why I felt compelled to send him some questions, because what does this mean for the average Catholic? No Catholic worthy of the name can be in communion with this Bergoglian church, but virtually the entire church, every member of the College of Cardinals, 99.9% of the bishops of the church, and the vast majority of the lay faithful recognize Pope Francis as the legitimate successor of Benedict and ultimately the successor of St. Peter. So what does he mean when he says no Catholic worthy of the name can be in communion with this Bergoglian church? Because Jorge Mario Bergoglio, according to the judgment of the church, is the Pope. So that's a question that needs to be answered, I think. What do you think, Bob?
Well, what we've got here is a conundrum in which, if Vigano is correct that heresy is being something different from church doctrine is being taught from the chair of St. Peter, that's a big problem. But the chair of St. Peter is occupied, so it's not a vacant chair, unless the occupant somehow got into that chair as if, say, a tourist came into St. Peter's Basilica, walked up to the front and sat down on it. But this process to elect this pope did proceed according to the conclave process, which has come into effect in recent centuries. Prior to this, the clergy of Rome, more recent centuries, the cardinals of Rome elected the successor of Peter. However, there is the fact that there are some doubts have been raised by a number of different scholars and journalists and even officials, prelates in the church, that perhaps something was done during the conclave that was not in keeping with the ordinary process or the legal process called for by John Paul II in the 1990s, when he set forth a slightly revised procedure for electing the Pope. And under that procedure, Benedict was elected in 2005 and Francis was elected in 2013. But that was an election under the unusual, almost, I would say, unprecedented circumstance of a resigned Pope. All of us, if we go back to those days, we could hardly grasp that because popes didn't resign. It wasn't on the horizon. So Benedict took that decision. The conclave was held, and somehow some people have brought into doubt that everything proceeded in a legal and precise way in keeping with the rules of the conclave. But these are the questions that have been proposed now, and they are institutionally destabilizing. And it's my position that they should be resolved, because we should not have confusion on these matters. And people do wish to be loyal sons of the church and to give the title of the leader of the church to the successor of Peter, divinely instituted by Jesus himself. So we can't maintain for long this situation, and we should resolve it for everyone as much as we can. It's our duty, really, to try to explain what the conflict is about and how it possibly could be resolved.
Yes. And that's ultimately what we're hoping to do by having this discussion and discussing these very important matters. So if we go back to the slideshow and we can go on to the next slide. So folks may recall, we discussed this, I think, during our last show, that on June 20th, the day that Archbishop Vigano made public the Vatican summons that he received, America Magazine falsely or incorrectly reported that he had presented himself in Rome. On the left side is the article that was written. I know we discussed it, and then they issued a correction after Archbishop Vigano issued a statement saying, which is on the right, I therefore wish to make it clear that I did not go to the Vatican yesterday, June 20th, and that I have no intention of going to the Holy Office on June 28th. And basically his reason is that he doesn't recognize the authority of that dicastery, he says, nor do I recognize the authority of its prefect, nor do I recognize the authority of the one who appointed him, which is obviously Pope Francis.
Yeah.
I have no intention of submitting myself to a show trial in which those who are supposed to judge me impartially in order to defend Catholic orthodoxy are at the same time those whom I accuse of heresy, treason, and abuse of power.
Okay.
So again, very strong words.
Matt, where's the date of this picture? I think it's 2015 in America, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it might say in the caption, which is kind of small to read on the screen, but it's a file photo, I think.
Okay, the fact that they reported in America, which is the weekly of the Jesuit order, America Magazine, even though it seems like it's about America, is a Jesuit magazine. And I was shocked and so I actually texted the Archbishop that day, and I said, "Did you come to Rome and did you present yourself as America has reported?" And he said, "No, I did not. I did not come." And then he issued this statement. So somebody said to me that they thought that was very unusual, that the article says that somebody in the dicastery informed the journalist that the Archbishop had come. So this is, on the face of it, some type of distortion, or what do we call it? Fake news, we would say. But
maybe disinformation.
Disinformation. And I just wanted to mention it because over the years, it's become clear to me that about half the news we get may be called news, and the other half is invented disinformation. And that second part seems to sometimes have elements in it of truth, but it's always got that poison pill. Something is wrong, something is distorted, and someone is behind it. They chose to do it. Therefore, someone was trying to, I guess, give the impression that he had submitted and come to Rome and accepted the process. But he himself then stated here he didn't accept the process at all because it contradicted his thesis, which is what led him to this impasse. And so there's a mechanism here that doesn't exist in the church that could judge between the two positions here. We don't have a possibility. I even would have desired to have had a meeting in prior years between the Archbishop and the Pope and other people around the Pope, because there's an inability. We've had bishops and cardinals write letters and dubia, and no answer is received. So there's some type of a malfunction here in what we might call in the family. It's, if we had children in a family saying, "Dad, we want to do this," or he says, "No, we're doing this," and they say, "Well, this is going to lead to big problems." You've seen dysfunctional families, haven't you, Matt?
Yes, it's a sad reality in the fallen world in which we live.
And in those cases, I think we're here in the church now, and we somehow need the help of, well, really divine help, because humanly speaking, it goes to this type of visible rupture. I am completely opposed to visible ruptures because I think it weakens the church. And I think that is the desire of the enemies of the church. So the cornerstone of my position, as it would be regarding a family. But of course, in some situations, the dysfunction becomes so great and so abusive, we might say, that the thing collapses. Am I correct, Matt?
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, I think Archbishop Vigano's position, well, I know his position is that Francis is not the true pope, as we will get into more in the slides to come. So I mean, from his perspective, he would say that Francis is not even the legitimate father of the family. He's a usurper and kind of like a stepfather or something that's encroaching on the role that doesn't belong to him. I suppose that would be his position.
I guess it would be, and I think it's a logical consequence of thinking for 2, 3, 4 years, how can he who committed his life to the service of the Holy See, that is the Holy See, the See is the seat, and it's the Holy See because it's the See of Peter, committed his life to work for it year after year for 40, 45, 50 years. And then he took this position that somehow he was no longer going to accept that guidance, that instruction, that conclusion on a number of matters.
So I see someone in the live chat. I think I might even know him. I think we go to the same parish. Hello, Ted Weber. And he asks a question that I think we should address because it is important. He says, wouldn't Michael Davies's defense of Archbishop Lefebvre apply to Vigano? And here's where the difference.
Yeah, let's explain first what was Michael Davies' defense of Archbishop Lefebvre. And I knew Michael Davies, a very wonderful British man who wrote books on the liturgy, the liturgical reform, and we had a lunch in Rome in the 90s, and I really liked Michael. But what did he say to defend Archbishop Lefebvre?
So before we get into that discussion, because I know it's going to go for several minutes, why don't we first remind viewers about the upcoming pilgrimage through Inside the Vatican Pilgrimages. We have a clip to play, and then we can get back into our discussion about Vigano and comparing him to Lefebvre.
All right. Roll the tape.
Join us on pilgrimage in 2024. This August, we are in Spain and France, Garabandal to Lourdes. September, we head to Mexico, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and we learn about the Flower World Prophecy. October, we return to Andalusia, Spain with Father Murr for a retreat and pilgrimage, and we end the year in Italy, Christmas in Rome for the beginning of the Jubilee year. We have a few seats left on each pilgrimage. Be sure to sign up now, and we hope to meet you on pilgrimage.
Okay, I guess people could go to the website thevaticanpilgrimages.com.
Yes.
There they can find a little form where they can leave a message. And it'd be great to see one or two people join us. And
yeah, I think we were talking before the show. There's a few slots left. So, and now is the time to sign up. You go to that website that's being displayed at the bottom of the screen, and that's scrolling text there. Join us on pilgrimage. Visit www.insidethevaticanpilgrimages.com to learn about everything you need to know for that and to sign up.
Okay, Matt, I don't like to go into commercial matters. I think of a pilgrimage, however, as a kind of spiritual journey. That's why we use the pilgrimages and embrace the pilgrimages as a way for us to support our work, but also to, we think, do something very positive in our own lives. In fact, by leading about 60 pilgrimages, I didn't expect to become a pilgrim, but in some way, I've changed and become more of a pilgrim than I was 15 years ago when this started.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what does it mean to be a pilgrim, Matt?
Yeah, I think of the passage in St. Paul's epistle to the Hebrews where he talks about that we don't have a lasting city on this earth, that we are, I forget the exact wording, but basically we are pilgrims journeying towards the kingdom of heaven.
Absolutely. I love that passage, and I suddenly understand that I was sort of drawn into this and we chose to do it, but I didn't realize that it transforms you. As you know, your feet get tired and you're in a group and you're trying to get to a sanctuary. There is a phrase in one poem by T.S. Eliot that he says, "No journey is worth making unless it ends in a sanctuary or a shrine or a cathedral," because those places are sacred and they remind us of our final home. So we go far away to stand in front of the holy.
All right, so why don't we get back to what the question from Mr. Weber about wouldn't Michael Davies' defense of Archbishop Lefebvre apply also to Archbishop Vigano? And so for those who don't know, Michael Davies was the champion of the traditional Latin Mass from England, the UK. He was also the president, I think, for a time of the International Federation Una Voce, very well-known apologist for the Catholic faith and the traditional Mass, and also for Archbishop Lefebvre up to the point of the consecrations, as I understand it, and which he didn't really agree with that decision. I don't think their friendship ended completely at that point. He still continued to esteem Archbishop Lefebvre, but he didn't agree with the decision to consecrate the four priests as bishops in 1988. But ultimately, as I understand it, Michael Davies would refer to Canon 1323 of the Code of Canon Law, 1983 code, which says, "No one is liable to a penalty who, when violating a law or precept, such as the prohibition against a bishop consecrating other men as bishops without a approval of the Pope." And then there are 7 different things that mitigate guilt, and one of them, number 4, is if that person acted under the compulsion of grave fear, even if only relative, or by reason of necessity or grave inconvenience, and specifically the reason of necessity, which is what Archbishop Lefebvre invoked, unless, however, the act is intrinsically evil or leads to the harm of souls, or tends to be harmful to souls. Excuse me. So that is all. As I understand it, that was ultimately Michael Davies' defense of Archbishop Lefebvre. Now, a significant difference between Archbishop Lefebvre and Archbishop Vigano is that obviously Archbishop Lefebvre, even though he on occasion expressed doubts saying, it's possible that Paul VI, for example, or John Paul II is not the true Pope, he did not go to the extent of Archbishop Vigano and saying, "I declare with certainty that Paul VI, Montini is not the Pope, or that Wojtyła is not the Pope." He continued to recognize them as the Pope. He always went to Rome when he was summoned to present his case and defend himself. So there are some differences, I think, between the two cases. What do you think, Bob?
Oh, I think there are differences. I think I think we're in a terrible situation right now, and I think we've moved into it in some ways alongside of the culture. And the culture wants the church as a handmaid. The church has tried to walk alongside of the culture for 60 years to the extent possible. And now the tensions between traditional morality and traditional Christian teaching and the new morality, the sexual revolution, the modernist worldview, the kind of secular worldview, we might call it, which in a profound way annihilates the sacred, says it's an illusion or the opium of the people, has so far apart that we were trying to keep our feet in each place in the tradition of the church and the understanding of sacrality and sin and forgiveness and penance, and this modern world where sin is almost annihilated. It's set aside. Each person has their own pathway in life, and we have to almost say the very choice itself is sacred, not the content of the choice. It, it's an individualistic and narcissistic view of the human person. And it's taken us so far that step by step we found ourselves either having to choose to remain in dialogue with the world or to finally stand over and say, this is too far. It's becoming too evil. It's leading to the death of unborn children. It's leading to the complete annihilation of individual souls, which are falling into damnation. Now, the very fact that judgment is not ours to make, which the Pope famously says, "Who am I to judge?" is presented as the key principle that the church needs to recall, and the church can't judge anybody. But the unfolding of these 60 years of, we might call, modernism, with the different view of the human person, who is now praised simply for being whatever he or she is and making whatever choice he or she wishes to make, is carrying us into a position of opposition. Vigano has tried to, he had doubts about certain things during his entire career. There were concerns he even expressed back at the time in the 1980s when there was the day of interreligious dialogue in Assisi. He said the Vatican officials, the monsignors like himself, he wasn't a bishop yet, and they said, "Well, what's John Paul doing?" But they didn't protest, and they were puzzled. And it's because if you carry certain things forward to their conclusion, they can contradict the faith, and certain aspects can be in coherence with, it can be brought to harmony with the faith, because you can argue, and if you're very attentive, you can say, we can always reach out to the souls of people in other faiths, but the centrality of Christ must always be maintained according to our belief. And if you set Christ aside, you move towards indifferentism. You're contradicting the entire 2,000 years teaching of the church. People have been debating these things ever since the council, and the culture has carried its own process forward until now. It's impossible, seemingly, at least in this particular case of Vigano. And for those who, it's because, are we going to then see a massive number of people finally take this step of saying we can't continue to be in fidelity to this particular Pope, or not?
Yeah. Well, I think if we get back to our slideshow, we should be on the slide where he's talking about, or we're going to get into his statement that he issued on June 28th. That's where we left off. Here we go. So these are just some highlights. It's a very long statement. I know that I'm pretty sure you published it in full through your Moynihan letters. It's also available elsewhere online at Catholic Family News. We published it as well. So here's just a little bit from that. So I explain, after quoting from Cum ex Apostolatus Officio, which is a 1559 legislative document in which Pope Paul IV declared that the election, of a heretic as the Roman pontiff is, quote, null, void, and worthless, Archbishop Vigano states, after quoting from that document, for this reason, with serenity of conscience, I maintain that the errors and heresies to which Bergoglio adhered before, during, and after his election, along with the intention he held in his apparent acceptance of the papacy, what he refers to as a lack of consent, a defective intention in accepting the papacy, these two things render his elevation to the throne null and void. And then later in the same document, he says, I accuse Jorge Mario Bergoglio of heresy and schism, and I ask that he be judged as a heretic and schismatic and removed from the throne which he has unworthily occupied for over 11 years. And he says this in no way contradicts the adage prima sedes nemine judicatur, which means the first see is judged by no one, meaning the Holy See, because it is evident, Vigano says, that since a heretic is unable to assume the papacy, he is not above the prelates who judge him. So in Vigano's mind, it is manifest, apparently, he thinks that Bergoglio adhered to heresies and essentially was a public heretic prior to his election to the chair of St. Peter in 2013. Now, Bergoglio was not held to be a public heretic by the church at that time, but Vigano, for some reason, is convinced that he was. And then the other element is this lack of a valid consent in accepting the papacy, because Vigano considers it obvious that Francis is not concerned with confirming his brethren in the faith, which is the role of the Pope, but rather to be a destroyer, essentially. That's how I understand his position.
I mean, I feel a certain uneasiness even in producing this podcast, because as I have from the beginning, I myself feel conflicted about the extent to which these questions can even be asked. But as a journalist, we sort of have a protection. We can say these questions are being asked. In other words, we're reporting something that's a fact.
Right.
There could be people who would say you simply should not report. Make a kind of a zone of silence, cone of silence, the old television program with Maxwell Smart. And he would, but I believe that somehow that would allow to fester and to be promulgated a type of gangrene or a type of rot. If we open to discussion these points, there can be some value and some help to our spirits. I could be wrong about that, because there are things that you don't want to focus on and wrestle with, because you can then become contaminated with some type of doubts, bring into question your own faith. So nevertheless, the truth shall set you free, and we have to understand also, for the sake of souls, both of Archbishop Vigano and of Pope Francis, if Archbishop Vigano is in any way correct, then Pope Francis is in grave danger.
And I want to mention that I see somebody in the live chat here, John Paul Sandoval, says, excellent discussion and points being made here. Thank you very much, John Paul. We appreciate that. And I also want to say, Bob, I think if it would help ease your conscience, these are issues that theologians, fathers and doctors of the church have discussed and debated over the centuries, and they've never been declared excommunicated for doing so. So,
right.
I mean, these are legitimate theological issues that do need to be discussed, because it's very serious, obviously.
I mean, we go back to Michael Davies and Lefebvre. Michael Davies said the canon law itself says if a person has a profound fear that some great evil will be caused if he doesn't do something. Like in the case of Lefebvre, consecrate bishops against the will of the Holy Father. He went ahead
Right.
and did it. For that, he incurred excommunication. But, and Vigano, in a sense, has followed the same path. But as canon law says, at least subjectively, but even objectively, subjectively, in Vigano's mind, he's doing the right thing.
Mhm.
Objectively, the church has judged him to be outside of the communion of the church. Vigano has responded that that judgment is not even a valid judgment because already the entire process has been so contaminated with what he calls modernism that the church is in profound confusion, and that he's doing the very best thing he can do to try to save souls and to return the church to the right path. That's his belief. Now, whether there are reasons why that is an invalid argument or not would have to be presented. And a lot of people think it's, on the face of it, the argument of an intransigent, sort of self-referential heretic who no longer accepts the papacy.
Mhm.
But in his own words, he believes that the papacy has itself rejected its role. And that's the argument he makes in this central paragraph here. The apparent acceptance of the papacy. What he is arguing is that Francis went into the conclave, knew, and he's arguing, knew in accord with the ideas of the San Gallen so-called mafia, with a word that one member, Cardinal Daniels, used jokingly to refer to themselves,
Mhm.
that they were going to bring about a change in the church by an opening to different positions that the church up to then had not been open to, and that the candidate to do that would be Pope Francis Bergoglio, and that when they voted for him and the man, the Chamberlain came over, the Camerlengo, and said, "You've been elected. Do you accept the office?" That's the moment.
Mhm.
That what Bergoglio was thinking is, yes, now I can accept this office in order to bring about some changes that are needed, not so much in keeping with the past, but needed because of modern thinking, because of new understanding of human nature. And I'm going to accept to carry out this new agenda. Vigano says that is an invalid acceptance because the very role of the Pope is to do only one thing: be faithful to the deposit of the faith. And he must say, I will accept, parenthesis, to be the guarantee, the final, the buck stops with me. I will defend the faith of all time without alteration, without change, without distortion, without any deviation.
Right.
Now, people have criticized Vigano's argument, saying you do not know what was in the Pope's mind, but he's presented it as a similar type case to entering into a marriage, where the man and the wife perform the sacrament, but if they have a hesitation or a doubt, or they're under compulsion, if someone's threatened the woman saying, if you don't marry him, we'll disown you or something, she's not acting out of free will. There's all these factors that take place that could compromise the efficacy of the union, of the sacramental union in marriage. Vigano is saying there may have been, and he believes there was, some impediment in the mind of Bergoglio of not wishing to be the type of pope or the Peter that other popes have been, because of a pre-agreed decision with many other leading modernists to try to change church teaching.
Mhm. All right. Well, we're about 40 minutes in now. I think in order to get to the conclusion, we might need to skip ahead a couple of slides.
Well, no, let's just proceed steadily.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the next slide is continuation of from his statement, and this is ultimate. I mean, as he said, and we read earlier. Let me go back here. in his June 20th announcement, he said, "It is no coincidence that the accusation against me concerns the questioning of the legitimacy of Jorge Mario Bergoglio and the rejection of Vatican II. As I mentioned, he says the council represents the ideological, theological, moral, and liturgical cancer of which the Bergoglian synodal church is the necessary metastasis." And now he's relating things again, ultimately back to the council. He says, "Since the council, the church has thus become the bearer of the revolutionary principles of 1789," referring to the French Revolution, as some of the proponents of Vatican II have admitted. "I consider it an honor," he says, "to be accused of rejecting the errors and deviations implied by the so-called Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, which," he says, "I consider to be completely devoid of magisterial authority due to its heterogeneity compared to all the true councils of the Church, which I fully recognize and accept, just as I fully recognize and accept all the magisterial acts of the Roman pontiffs."
Yeah, these are powerful and sort of disturbing words because each of us has a tremendous devotion and loyalty to the teaching magisterial authority of the church. And it's not been a common view that that authority was completely contaminated or turned into some type of cancer by something entering into the mind and soul and heart of many of the protagonists, therefore changing church doctrine. This is a view that the Archbishop himself did not come to until he had been thinking about it for several years.
Mhm.
From the time he retired through the time he denounced abuse, moral abuse, sexual abuse. That was the main burden of the testimony in 2018. But then, as he kind of thought through how we had reached this position and what needed to be done to kind of go back and get back on the right course, he traced it back month by month, year by year, and in letter after letter, finally coming to this position that there had been a departure that had woven into the documents of the Second Vatican Council certain time bombs, which could be interpreted in a theologically orthodox way, but could also be interpreted as novelties, as changes in church teaching. And
My,
that
my,
that
I
has
just
never been,
wanted
that process has never been completed.
Right. I just wanted to interject something. My predecessor at Catholic Family News, John Venari, God rest his soul, I remember years ago he wrote an article called "The Original Sin," in quotes, of Vatican II, which ultimately he identified as ambiguity. So the
Yeah.
things that are open to interpretation one way or the other, which even Cardinal Casper, I think, has publicly. Yeah, I remember I've cited that in an article for CFN that he's publicly admitted. I think it was on Vatican Radio even, that the council itself, certain phrases in the documents open up this uh, interpretation one or the other, and create that conflict basically.
Well, absolutely. And in order not to shock people, I think we could say Jesus went through his passion. The evil one and the evil in the world, the hatred of him, the desire to silence him, the arresting of him, the beating of him, the crucifying of Jesus, means that there can be a tremendous hatred of the truth. And the church is the bearer of this same truth. It's the body of Christ in time, extended for 2,000 years. It's not to be a surprise that there could be attempts made first to eliminate the church, silence the church, end its voice, or if it would seem more deviously effective, to enter into the church and to somehow uh, defeat the church from the inside. In other words, if there's evil and it wants something evil for mankind, it's probably going to try to find some way to diminish the truthfulness of the church. And so none of this battle can be a surprise to us, is what I'm arguing.
Right.
In other words, if you're talking about the leading authority of God in the world, the very presence of the Son of God in the world, carried forward into a secular world which doesn't want it, they're going to be every method sought to diminish, to weaken, to divide. And that's why I hope we're not contributing to such a division, but to an understanding that we have got to stand more so now than ever to try to make the family of the church, the family of the body of Christ, one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic.
Yes. Yes. So the next two slides in our presentation are basically just some key quotes from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith's penal decree. This is dated July 4th of this year, and Archbishop Vigano made it public again through his social media and on his website the following day, July 5th. And basically is simply saying, having carefully considered everything involved with the case, it's a 20 plus page long document. We'd need another show to go through it in detail, but ultimately it says, for the public good of the people of God, the DDF declares that His Excellency Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano is guilty of the reserved crime of schism. The offender has occurred excommunication late sententiae, which means automatically. So it's not an excommunication that's been imposed as something over and above the offense itself. It's the Holy See attaches it to the offense of schism, which they believe Archbishop Vigano is guilty of, and so it's an automatic penalty, which has simply been declared. The same as they claim happened with Archbishop Lefebvre. And it also says the removal of the censure in this case is reserved to the Apostolic See. And further, the offender is warned that in accordance with Canon 1364, Section 2, if prolonged contumacy, or the gravity of the scandal so requires, he may be punished with other penalties, not excluding dismissal from the clerical state, which has not yet happened. We hope it doesn't get to that point. That's part of why we're doing this, is to try and help facilitate some sort of a resolution.
And there's another spot in here, we don't have it on the screen, but it says this is not done as a punishment, but it's a kind of measure to bring the Archbishop to the possibility of changing his position and restoring a type of communion if he should so decide. In other words, the excommunication is not just a punishment, but a spur to...
It's meant to be medicinal, yeah. It's not simply retributive or it's not simply retribution or something, but it's meant to be medicinal. So
okay, let's go forward then, Matt, because it's such a tragic case. It's a division in the church. It's the lopping off from the church or the institutional structures of the church of a very otherwise admirable archbishop, but who has taken upon himself the decision to judge the heretical character of the leadership of the church. So it seems insoluble.
Mm-hmm. So it was after this, it was in the midst of all this, I should say. I think it was on June 30th, or if I remember correctly, that I decided to send the Archbishop some questions. He was able to answer some of them, which we'll now get into in our remaining time together today.
And I'll just say, July 4th was the day of the excommunication. So all viewers can simply, at least if you're Americans, that's the 4th of July, Independence Day.
Right.
That's the day of the excommunication. And just after that, Matt got in touch, I believe by email, right, Matt?
Yes, through email.
And the Archbishop agreed to an interview.
Yes, and he was able to complete answers to some of my questions, not all of them. And then he just informed me, I guess last week, about a week ago, that he doesn't think he's going to be able to finish our interview due to just lack of time and all the demands being made on his time. But I wanted to go through a little bit of the interview that I did with him. I think you'll have to back up a slide if we want to start it. There we go. So I asked him, because his as I see it, his position seems to have shifted a little bit, and I was hoping he could clarify his position, and I was curious to see what he would say. So I say in your June 28th statement, the one we just finished going over a few minutes ago, you distinguish the conciliar church from the Catholic Church in such a way that you assert that there are two churches, certainly, whereas in the past you have affirmed obviously there are not two churches, something that would be impossible, blasphemous, and heretical. Thus, it seems your position has changed. Do you now hold that the conciliar church, in quotes, is completely separate from the Catholic Church, rather than a subversive sect that exists within the true church? That's my question. And the Archbishop responded, my position has not changed. There is only one true church, and that is the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church. But there are, in fact, two superimposed realities. That's where he uses the analogy of an eclipse, so to speak. One of which is the true church, precisely, and the other is the false church, the deep church. If you pay attention in my statement, J'accuse, I expressly wrote two churches with a lowercase initial or lowercase c to underline the anomaly of this coexistence. And then his answer continues on the next slide.
Congratulations on having this interview, Matt. It's kind of impressive and moving to try to have the actual voice of the Archbishop responding to your questions, and we're trying to understand his position. Go ahead.
Yes. So if we move ahead to the next slide, again, there's a lot of text here. I won't go over it all because we're running short on time. So what he says is that the conciliar church is doctrinally, morally, and liturgically separate from the Catholic Church, but at the same time, its hierarchy calls itself Catholic, and as such demands obedience from the faithful of the true church. This hierarchy does not represent the true church of Christ, but claims to represent her, because if it were to officially separate itself from her, it would no longer be able to avail itself of the authority and authoritativeness of the true church and would have to act like any other heretical sect. And he elsewhere in his interview, he uses an analogy he has in the past of comparing the situation to, you have a state or a nation, a true government, and then you have what he calls the deep state, what many people call the deep state, which is like a subversive group of people within the true government who are acting to subvert things and mess things up and work for an ulterior agenda other than the common good of the people. He essentially says that's what we're facing in the church as well. So he ends the interview by saying, the problem is therefore not whether we are in the church, but rather whether those who usurp her authority to demolish the church are part of the church. They are the ones who must be kicked out, not us. Obviously a reference to his excommunication, I would assume.
And then read the last sentence there.
Yeah, so it says, they are not part of the church whose authority they have usurped. Therefore, they are not entitled to do what they do and cannot in any way demand obedience from the faithful.
Well, that's a very stark contrast that is presented from the Archbishop. How many people do you think are confused or disturbed by this, Matt?
I think a lot of people. I think I've been trying to watch some of the live comments as we've been going, and I think there's even disagreement with within the people who are watching our show today, that some people think that Archbishop Vigano has gone too far. Others are saying, I stand with Vigano. I think he's in the right. So I think all of this requires a very delicate, very careful analysis in light of sound Catholic theological principles.
Okay, I have Darius Clovis, who says, what is the nature and purpose of authority? If a captain of a ship said and intended to blow up the ship under his command, that intent would ruin or nullify the authority of the captain. What do you think of that remark?
Yeah, obviously the Pope has the supreme authority in the church, and he has no human superior on earth. But there's a difference between supreme authority and absolute authority. As Pope Benedict famously said, the Pope is not an absolute monarch whose thoughts and desires are law. I think I got the quote right, from when he was installed, when he took possession of St. John Lateran, the cathedral church of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. That was back in either April or May of 2005, after he was elected. And he said those famous words: the Pope is not an absolute monarch. So even the Pope is bound by divine and natural law, by the traditions of the church, the customs of the church. So he can't just run amok and do whatever he feels like.
Hmm. Well, but who can judge that, Matt?
Well, I think, you've had Peter Kwasdewski on your show, for example, and he's written an excellent book. It was actually originally a lecture that he gave at the Catholic Identity Conference a few years ago. I was blessed to be there in the front row listening to him as he delivered it, and he received several standing ovations. But he explains in this booklet, which is available from Sophia Institute Press, it's called True Obedience in the Church. He explains the nature and purpose of obedience in light of the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa, for example, and other fathers and doctors of the church. I don't have my copy handy to grab, but he basically explains what I'm explaining now, that the purpose of authority is to serve the common good. As Jesus told the apostles, the Gentiles tend to lord their authority over others and use it for their own personal gain. I'm paraphrasing, but it will not be so among you. Whoever wishes to be the greatest must be the servant of all. And that's the traditional title of the Pope. I think Pope Gregory the Great coined this: the servant of the servants of God.
Servus servorum Dei.
And ultimately, he's a servant of God. He's also a servant of the church, and he is the true guardian of tradition. We have the document from 2021 restricting access to the traditional Latin Mass, and it's ironically titled Guardians of the Tradition, Traditionis Custodes. Well, part of that tradition is the traditional Latin Mass, but that's another subject.
Okay, just for me to be provocative, how can the church continue if there is continual disobedience to the Pope? This is not a Catholic position.
Right, and I think that's what we need to get into more next week. I would like to share the other questions that I asked Archbishop Vigano, and he just doesn't have the time to answer them, at least not in the context of our interview. He did assure me that he intends to answer them in some manner in the future, whether it be in a future statement or something. So I look forward to hearing his answers on these questions, which are very important, they're rooted in very important critical theological principles that need to be addressed.
We have concordancia de fe. I guess it's concordance of faith. The Pope is a vicar, one that needs to keep what we received and teach that which we received, or the apostles, rather. But that is it. He is to confirm in the faith. Well, that is. Now, Francis at one time said, I am a son of the church. He wanted to maintain that he was submissive, in a sense, to the teaching of the magisterium, and would follow it and interpret it. And yet he seems to have often said, in my personal humanity, I would like, for example, to imagine that hell is empty, or different statements that he's made over the years that people are puzzled, and they say that's not in keeping with what's been presented. And in addition, his reaction on the moral side to so many cases of abuse in the church, where he seems not to want to clarify and immediately believe the people who've been abused, the victims of abuse, but to say, no, these are inventions, these are made up. But on the other hand, maybe in this time, a curmudgeon like him, a man who has his strength to say, I want to do this, I want to do this, is there any value in that you see, Matt, in a crazy world like the one we have today?
Oh, what was your question exactly again?
Well,
How you,
the fact that the Pope is so uh, makes decisions that no one can penetrate, and no one can. He doesn't have the reasons. He just makes such. He's authoritarian, we might say.
well, I mean, even if he has technically the power to do so, I would say that it's immoral to do so because it's not being a good father. A good father, at least to some extent, explains his decisions and does not act in an arbitrary and tyrannical manner. And the doctors of the church are very clear that we do have the right, as members of the mystical body of Christ, to resist such tyrannical behavior. We don't have to submit to being abused by a tyrant.
Okay. The other side of the coin is the church canon law, which we cited already today in regard to Lefebvre. If a person is fearing a great evil, then he is acting out of that concern to prevent that evil. He is not objectively, well, certainly subjectively, but also objectively able to be condemned by canon law. He does something that ordinarily would be wrong, but if that's his motivation, and so that we have a tremendous value in our canon law that supports the individual conscience, is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how far this could extend in order for us to meet these challenges today. But I am deeply grateful that the church did not present us, and over the centuries, did not present us with an authoritarian, almost totalitarian regime, but rather a regime where there are laws that protect the consciences of people against religious domination, sometimes even cruelty. But we do preserve always the idea of the value of our obedience to authority. In other words, what I'm trying to wrestle with are some contradictions that we face as we watch what's happening. And we have to make a decision. Where do we stand? And who do we stand with?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we'll definitely continue the discussion next week and hopefully get
Well,
some.
but I was going to ask you then, Matt, though, we will continue, but didn't you write to the Archbishop that you disagreed with him on something?
Well, yes, he does know that I don't share his belief that Francis is not the Pope, and I did offer him some explanations as to why that is the case, which I would like to share with the audience next week, if I may, going into some traditional teachings concerning the peaceful and universal acceptance of a man as the Pope, for example, the connection of that to what's called dogmatic facts, which is a secondary object of the church's infallibility as taught by the traditional theologians, and then also get into the nature of the crimes of heresy and schism and kind of see where things are at in light of those traditional teachings.
Well, what is your hope, Matt, in the face of all this? And maybe we'll be ending soon, but how do you see a possibility of some good coming from all of this?
Well, I think ultimately the good, even if there's no practical solution or resolution with Archbishop Vigano, the allowing the truth to be known and proclaiming it is a good in and of itself. As our Lord says, if you remain in my word, you will be my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So the truth is always a good thing. And I want to give some attention to these perhaps lesser known truths about the nature of papal elections and what theologians have traditionally taught about them, and contribute that to this discussion, because I think it's very easy to fall. And I'll close with this. In the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 5, Moses warns the people, don't deviate to the left or to the right. Stay in the middle. Stay in the middle. And that's what we're trying to do here.
I'm glad you brought that up. And we've got two great examples of history, the history of the people of Israel in the Old Testament, everything always is perfect for them, isn't it?
Far
No,
from it.
no disputes, and no prophets who are actually killed. They were killed. They did kill the prophets.
hmm
And there were various disagreements of profound nature and some kings who were regarded as evil. And then we have the history, 2,000 years of our church. We've got two great schisms, one with the Orthodox and one with the Protestants. And it's breaking of our heart that we should have Christians who cannot be Christians together. I in a sense, long for that unity, but at the same time, events have occurred, decisions were taken, and only some great sacrifice, I think, in each case would be required to overcome the centuries of distrust, of fear, of condemnation. And now the very structure of the Roman Catholic Church again seems to be in danger of unraveling under the pressure of modernism. So it could be another great division. And it would be wonderful if we could prevent the division, the weakening of the faith, the weakening of the church. And I think you mentioned earlier, we need a mechanism, a kind of panel or a forum where we seek the truth together in reason and arrive at it. And I guess they would say this is the synodal process, but we're not really participating much in it. We're just reporting on it. But maybe we need a process of dialogue and try to keep the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church protected, together, united, and open to receive others, including from the Protestant and Orthodox communities.
Well, I'll look forward to continuing the discussion next week, Bob. And thank you to everyone who's joined us live. Please do remember to like the video, share it on your social media accounts. That really does help to spread it far and wide, and we need your help to grow our community. So please do that. And until next week, God bless you.
Thank you, Matt.
Join us on pilgrimage in 2024. This August, we are in Spain and France, Garabandal to Lourdes. September, we head to Mexico, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and we learn about the Flower World Prophecy. October, we return to Andalusia, Spain with Father Murr for a retreat and pilgrimage, and we end the year in Italy, Christmas in Rome for the beginning of the Jubilee year. We have a few seats left on each pilgrimage. Be sure to sign up now, and we hope to meet you on